Hello everybody. This drawing is going to be a little bit more about industrial design or retail design and how to give a nice presentation of design concepts. So this style is going to be in a more kind of old school line drawing and color kind of a look. Not too dissimilar from traditional American comic books in its basic hierarchy, where you have black ink lines which are then colored in and rendered. So I've gone ahead and created the line drawing in pen and ink on paper and scanned it in, and now I'm adding all of the color and rendering in Photoshop. And the subject matter of this design is a fleet of pedal cars, so self-propelled sort of pedicab things, except they're juice bars. So the concept is that the operators would pedal these into different locations in a city, like let's say a park or a playground or whatever, and they would be a self-contained juice bar where you could get like custom made organic juices and things like that. And so there was a fleet of those, and these things, since they would be operated in an outdoor setting, an important part of the drawing is to give an outdoor context. So I've drawn out these items sitting in what would probably be like a municipal park or something, with some office buildings in the background. So they would be catering to people who are maybe on their lunch break or walking to work or something like that. And you can see I'm spending quite a bit of time on the background, and there are several reasons for that. One is, in this kind of a design, it's very important to show context. So if you were designing something like a shampoo bottle or something, that object could be just sitting in a blank space and it would be fine, but the whole story and concept of this particular product is that it operates within a context. So I need to start showing what happens, where this is happening, and where it's happening is part of that story. The other reason that the environment is important in this case is because there's space involved. So there's a pretty large amount of distance between the viewer and the object in the background that's in the furthest back. Like those buildings might be like 100 feet away from the viewer. So I really need to convince the viewer of that amount of space, and the best way to do that is to spend a lot of times working on the big planes. Like the plane, that ground plane is really going to give you the biggest indication that there's space, and also that the buildings in back, they're kind of, all those buildings and even the ground plane, they have to straddle a very tricky fence. You want to make sure that the viewer understands the background, that this is like an urban environment. It's not in the middle of a forest or whatever, but the environment also should not be clamoring for a lot of attention. You should see it, but then you know that you're not focusing on that area at all. So that's sort of a tricky balance that needs to be choreographed as I'm developing this artwork, and you'll see me going back and forth and fine-tuning that relationship. Like right now, the background is much too heavy, and I've spent most of my time rendering the background, so there's probably too much going on there now, and I'll go back and balance that out. the the ultimate purpose of this drawing is to sell the client on the idea and on the way that the idea is implemented. In this case, the client is the people who are going to actually be building and operating these things. But the other purpose of this drawing is also, this is the first time that I myself am seeing a pretty faithful rendering of what the design looks like. Like I've already I've worked out the design in this form of very rough sketches. So the client was very specific about what kind of how this juice bar would work and the size, and they even worked out, you know, the maximum weight that these things could be, and so they've already given specific instructions, and it was up to me to sort of build out the forms and the aesthetics. So this is not just an exercise in presenting the idea to the client, but it's also my tool to see, is my design working, or are the specific design solutions that I came up with working, or do I need to tweak those? Do I need to go back in and I'm hoping I don't need to go in and change the actual designs, but some of the colors that I worked out, some of the materials that I worked out, like I still have to fine tune that. So this is also a tool for me as a designer to fine tune my actual work. And right now, you know, mostly what's going on is kind of the noodling aspect of putting in all the smaller materials and textures. But again, it's impossible to evaluate the design without all that stuff being put in. So, you know, once I start putting in things like those tires or the wood or something, or the black umbrellas, do those overwhelm the design and make it too dark? Do I need to go back in and change those colors? It's all part of this process that I'm working out here. And also the same with the figures. The purpose of the figure in architectural renderings is mostly going to be just for scale. Like if it's an office building, you just want to show people walking on the street, and that's about it. But for some of these industrial design or retail design renderings, the scale figures start to become part of the story itself, in that if it's this kind of a product here, you want to show the staff are wearing those maroon shirts. You want to show them kind of doing what's expected of the staff, like handling these fresh fruits and vegetables, pedaling the bike. You want to show the customer, the sort of the ideal customer. What would they look like? In this case, it's going to be people, you know, walking, running errands in the street, taking a lunch break, whatever. But, you know, in some instances, the scale figure can be a big part of the story. Like I've done some renderings of like cosmetics displays where the scale figures are dressed in all of the latest fashions, because the client knows that their cosmetics are supposed to be talking to a high-end fashion consumer. So you want to show that kind of ideal customer using their product. That sort of is a nice way of reinforcing to the client that you understand the nature of their business. In this case, it's not as important, but those are the kind of things that should be considered when putting in scale figures. They shouldn't just be, in my opinion, they shouldn't be too generic. And again, if you're working on a product that has specific interactions, then the scale figures should also be used to tell that story. Like, let's say if it's an information kiosk with a touch screen, you want to show people pushing buttons on that touch screen so that it's clear that the product is, what does the product have to offer the customer. The product is not just a study in aesthetics. The product is an enabler for particular behaviors of the customer, and if you can show those behaviors taking place, then it just sort of reinforces the whole story of the drawing in general. And like I said before, I'm still tweaking overall effects of the actual aesthetic piece. I'm still going into that background because the background is my arena to balance the composition out. The the shapes of the objects are a given. That's my design. I need to explain the design. The design has to look a particular way, and also the arrangement of the objects is a given because I want to arrange those objects in the scene so that you can kind of see different angles of the object. I want to show how the object is being used, and also the configuration. The client wanted these things to be something that is peddled as an individual outpost to maybe a playground or something, but they could also be arranged in that sort of circled wagons configuration where they make like a pop-up cafe where they're paired with that kind of Airstream trailer that's in the background. That's a larger juice bar, and then you have these smaller things that kind of define a perimeter, so that all of those things, the arrangement of the objects and the shapes of the objects are a given, and then it's really the background and the context that are my big tool in telling the user how their eye should scan this canvas. So I've added another layer in Photoshop here that almost looks like a mist or a fog, and that's lots of people use that. They refer to it as atmospheric perspective, because the concept being that if you're looking at, let's say, a mountain range, the mountains way off in the distance are going to be obscured by a lot of haze, and that'll fool the eye into thinking that those mountains are very far away. And obviously in this case you're not going to get a bunch of fog and haze between objects that are 20 feet apart. Like they're much too close to actually have atmospheric perspective, but I'm still doing that because I want to really reinforce that sense of distance and push the buildings and that larger cart into the background, because I want to choreograph the way that the eye moves across this canvas, so the eye is focusing on the areas that have a lot of detail and contrast. That's where I want the eye to focus, and the things that are sort of washed out, I want the viewer to say, like, okay, I understand that, but it's not so important, because if I'm just dropping a bunch of objects in there and saying, okay, viewer, you figure out what's going on, then I haven't done my job as an artist. As an artist, my job is to take responsibility for what I've drawn and say, this is the important stuff. Now look at this other important thing. Now consider what this next thing is doing and why it's there. Like, for example, all that fresh fruit that I've put in those baskets is highly rendered because part of the story of these carts is that they're offering this like freshly made organic juices and smoothies. So all those little little details are highly important to what the viewer is seeing. So I'm emphasizing those things and making sure that you really zoom in on that stuff. Like I said, this is my first view at this design, so I still have to use this drawing as a tool to refine my design. Like in the original design, the bottom of these the carts were going to be metal, and then I realized no, they're way too drab and they're falling, they're just disappearing. So I changed the color of them to a green color. That was a later addition, because I could see that it needed that additional reinforcement of the brand, which had a lot of greens and blacks in its brand identity. And actually I've cut the video short. The only part that I didn't include here is the part where I'm putting in the client's actual logos on these carts. And I just did that because I'm not sure if the client want to be identified. This is a commercial job, so I didn't want to sort of get their identity involved in this video. But other than that, this drawing is done. So that's the whole process. There, as always, I've sped up the rendering to about 4 times its original length. I think I had about 4 hours to complete this whole illustration, and about 2 hours were devoted to generating the line work. So the total time that I spent coloring it was about 2 hours, and in this case, that's plenty. It's just an idea sketch, so I don't want to really spend more time than that noodling it to death, because it could be that the client just doesn't want to do it after all, and then there's no point in over rendering something that only needs to be looked at for a couple of minutes. But anyway, this is the finished piece here, and I hope the video was helpful or informative to you, and I will talk to you next time. All right, take care.